Stream on the History Vibe podcast, and today I'm joined by Dr. John Dominic Crossan and Dr. Michael Okinsich Cruz. And today we're discussing their co-authored book titled Jesus and Justice, Organizing for God's Reign on Earth Then and Now. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you both for joining me today.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much for having us.
Pleasure to be here, Jacob, with you and everybody who's watching.
So for my first question, this is for both of you. How is the Jesus story a story of revolution?
Dom, I'll defer to you first.
All right. Well, one warning about it is he got himself crucified, and the Romans didn't waste a squad of executioners and iron nails if they didn't want to make a statement to the populace. This was state terrorism in the first century. Don't do what this guy did, or you'll end up like this guy has. And the Romans didn't bother rounding up his top lieutenants, we call them the disciples, the 12, because they knew he was nonviolent. It was a matter of taking out the leader. So honestly, the most important thing beyond any text or anything else is I trust Pilate to do what a Roman governor, sub-governor actually, did. So I'd want to begin with there. He got himself crucified alone. By that I mean there wasn't 12 crosses up there or 13 crosses up there. So I think he was a revolutionary, a non-violent revolutionary. Thank you, Pilate, for, for letting us know that. And Tacitus and, of course, Josephus for telling us the same story.
And what I would share, and much of my knowledge over the years about the historical Jesus has come from Dom and Dom's work and the work of the other historians. And what's been revealed through Dom's work and the work of others is that while there was a Son of Man, Son of God, Prince of Peace in Jesus, there were also claims that Caesar Augustus was the Son of God, the
Yeah.
Son of Man, the Prince of Peace, here to bring peace on earth through victory, through military victory, and through imperial domination. That was the ideological claim of the Roman Empire. Jesus's nonviolent revolution was about bringing forth God's justice, God's peace, God's reign on earth through nonviolent means and through justice. This was fundamentally Jesus's movement, a movement not only to proclaim God's justice, God's peace, God's love, the manifestation of God's vision on earth. It was also, in doing so and communicating this, a counter revolution against the Roman Empire. Their economic system, their political system, their ideological system, the claims that they made. Um, God's God's reign was fundamentally incompatible with the Roman Empire's way of doing business in the world. And so Jesus was executed and crucified precisely because he directly challenged the Roman Empire. And he built quite an inspiring movement that generated vast interest and following from peasants across Judea. And so we very see clearly in Jesus's ministry his deep solidarity with those who are poor and marginalized and exploited and who were being crushed by this Roman imperial system.
Could you expand on, Mike, could you expand a little bit more on are there parallels between the way Augustus is expressed and Jesus, especially on the divinity aspect?
Well, I think today, you know, Caesar Augustus, I think for a whole multitude of reasons, liked being having the deity association connected to his name. One, it made him even more powerful, because he was here was, the Son of God, the Son of Man. And so it almost cast in a layer, a cloak of invincibility upon him. And if you want to consolidate power in an empire, you not only have to consolidate economic power, military power,
Mhm.
political power, but ideological power. And that, again, is something that Dom has talked about in his works. What are the sources of power for empires? Here in the United States being the most powerful empire in the world currently, we have the most powerful economy, the most powerful military. There's significant tectonic shifts happening with regards to the United States' geopolitical position in the world. But for decades, the United States was the most important political player on the global scene. But also in the United States, we've held a great deal of ideological power that based on the claims of capitalism, democracy. But early on in the country's founding, we saw the ideological force of manifest destiny at play. This idea that God had specifically ordained the United States to grow as a nation, as a city on top of the hill. And in the current context that we find ourselves in, our current president himself has welcomed the type of claims that clergy have offered in terms of Trump being divinely ordained by God to lead the United States in this moment. Even recently or during the most recent presidential election cycle, when President Trump was nearly assassinated, which is something that we should certainly not welcome in this country because violence in nature is escalatory. But after that assassination attempt, many people claimed again that God had saved and intervened in saving President Trump's life, that this was further evidence and proof of his divine calling, his divine position. Some people went on to speculate that they could see the outline of an angel intervening in the moment that the bullet passed by Trump. This is dangerous when we get into this territory of claiming that imperial leaders, political leaders have been divinely ordained by God to rule a nation or an empire. It's idolatrous. And that was certainly prevalent during Jesus's time with regards to the way that the Roman Empire claimed its divine power, and that Caesar Augustus was at the head of the table of this imperial power, and that he himself was divinely ordained was a claim that certainly Jesus' people challenged vehemently by recognizing Jesus as the Son of God, by claiming Jesus as the Son of Man. You can't see it other than it being a direct frontal challenge to Roman imperial theology and ideology.
What do we know about the character of Pilate, Dom?
We know more about the character of Pilate, I think, than any other governor or sub-governor of the Levantine coast in that first century, because in fact, we know him from Josephus and from Philo, philosopher of Alexandria. Philo actually makes him so bad, you almost want to say, oh, come on, he can't be that bad, because Philo makes him a postal boy for a bad governor. He goes on and on and on, everything you could think of. Rapine, slaughter, he mentions twice actually, uh, condemning people without trial. Oops, that's very close to the bone. So, on the one hand, Philo makes him a poster boy for a bad governor. On the other, Josephus mentions that he was in, wait, I don't think he gives us the dates exactly, but 26 to 36. Now, that's 10 years. Usually they're stuck over there, and that's probably the way they saw it, stuck at the back of beyond with a recalcitrant people they didn't understand. And 2 years was enough. Let's get back to Rome. 10 years? So he was probably fed up. Eventually, Rome had to fire him, send him back to Tiberius, who was then the governor, to explain himself, along with Caiaphas, by the way. So their collaboration, Caiaphas, the high priest, and the sub-governor under Syria, of course, Pilate, were both sent, well, they weren't both sent back to Rome. Pilate was sent back to Rome. Caiaphas was fired. So from the Roman point of view, they didn't work out even. And in fact, Roman governance of Israel was a disaster. It went backwards and forwards. First they had a king, then they had four princes or three princes, and then they had a king again, a king of the Jews. And then they had a governor. Then, like, they couldn't make up their mind how to run this country. And eventually Tacitus said, Tacitus, a Roman historian, not particularly sympathetic to Jews, said the patience of the Jews lasted into the 60s. And then the war began, the War of 66. So even Tacitus admitted we really were a bad administration. So Pilate is just part of a bad administration. And he is a bad example in a bad administration.
Why was Jesus executed, Mike?
Well, for many of the reasons Dom shared, I think in the opening, Jesus's ministry was directly challenging Roman imperial rule in a lot of ways. That in our book, we talk about how Jesus's ministry went directly to Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. We articulate in the work the significance of the profound transformation of the Sea of Galilee into Lake Tiberias, that this natural resource, this body of water that produced fish and resources for village people who lived along the coast, that it became a source to be extracted heavily by Rome and by the local
Yeah,
um,
good
you
old
know
Antipas.
yes, good old Antipas. And so Jesus's ministry along the coast was in direct response to this. And he was constantly challenging the economic system of suffering that the Roman Empire produced. And, eventually, as we get to in the book, the dual demonstrations, the counter procession on Palm Sunday, and then the disruptive demonstration in the temple was a direct challenge to this cooperation that produced suffering and pain and dehumanization that the Roman Empire and the Jewish high priest were engaged in. Certainly, Rome was the power, uh,
Mhm.
but that imperial system created vast suffering and pain. And the religious hierarchy, the Jewish high priests certainly were not helping matters through their cooperation with Pilate and the Roman Empire. And so Jesus went directly to the source of power in Jerusalem, chose the particular time of year during Passover, which is the most potentially explosive time of the year with regards to the celebration of the Exodus story, which is fundamentally about God's liberating the Jewish people from their bondage in Egypt. And here they are celebrating Passover and recognizing, as any of us would as well if we were in a similar predicament, that while they're celebrating Passover and God's deliverance and God's presence with them as they escaped from bondage in Egypt, that here they are all over again as a people in bondage, exploited, marginalized, trampled upon, executed in public view constantly, um, for any form of challenge against the Roman Empire. And so Dom's scholarship shows us as well that nonviolent revolutionaries were executed through crucifixion. And Jesus, as a nonviolent revolutionary, was executed for his ministry, for his vision, for the movement, the reign of God movement that he led. And there's something that is important to recognize is that we use the term crucifixion more commonly today. It was a public execution, just like lynchings in the United States um, were a form of public terror and public execution to demonstrate to an already oppressed and marginalized people that they should not resist the powers that be. And so the public execution of Jesus was clearly intended to send a message to Jesus's people that this movement was dead, that they had their fun, their leader was gone, and that they should just accept their lot in life, and that the Roman power was not to be messed with.
Can I pick up on that, Jacob, for a minute?
Sure.
If you look at the picture, the virtual background that both of us are using, apart from the advertisement for our book, it's the Sea of Galilee. It's a painting by the Hungarian-born uh, archaeological artist Balázs Balázs. And I want to begin there because you can't understand really what happened in Jerusalem and what Jesus was doing in Jerusalem and why he went to Jerusalem without beginning in Galilee. And it's not just because you have to go to the beginning always. If you look at the parallel courses that, say in the year 20 CE, Antipas had decided to change his capital. Now, you should stop immediately. What on earth is he up to? You don't change your capital. That'll really annoy everyone. Just imagine. If you're, how are you going to sell a used villa on Sepphoris? If I'm a high aristocrat in the court of Antipas and now I have to move 20 miles to the east, I can't commute every morning. So why on earth does Antipas change his capital? That's an historical question. And you're not trying to read his mind, you're trying to figure what's he up to. And what he's up to is changing his capital to monetize the lake. Okay, he's learned how to multiply the loaves and the lovely valleys around Sepphoris. Now he's going to learn how to multiply the fishes. So when Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fishes, however you explain it, it's a direct challenge who's in charge of the lake. So what Antipas is doing, he's got a new capital. It's on the lake because he's going to monetize the lake and change the commons, the common. Think of the Cambridge Commons or think of the Boston Commons where people could take their animals out freely. Think of the lake as a commons, the Lake of Galilee. Now, along comes Tiberius and it becomes the Lake of Tiberius. Now, it could be the change of a cartography is a minor detail, like changing the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Maybe it's just cartography, but maybe it's a revelation of something far more deeply, profoundly wrong. And that's what's happening. Antipas has commercialized the lake to become part of Roman imperialism, could be called Mediterranean globalization. That's what they're doing. They're not gathering all these lands just to have fun. They are making, you can caricature it as globalization. Come on, it's just the Mediterranean. But they're globalizing the Mediterranean. And the Levantine coast, Israel, fits into it. And in his own little way, Antipas is turning the lake into a monopoly. He will have garum. He'll make that sauce that the Romans loved, and I've never quite able to listen to the ingredients without wincing, but that's me. Garum or salted fish or dried fish, and they'll go straight to Tyre and into the Mediterranean globalization. You won't be able to go in and toss your net in and have a boat. So everything that's going on there sets Jesus up against the Roman Empire. And that's why he gets invited to take his movement to Jerusalem. And we know what happened.
How did tradition get traction in Galilee, Dom?
Well, in one sense, I really answered that question, but let me join it. Imagine the two parallel movements, geographical parallel movements. Antipas leaves, 20 for round numbers, just in the year 20, Antipas leaves inland Sepphoris, up on a nice mound, by the way. It's quite a lovely spot, nice breeze up there. And he goes to Lakeshore, Tiberias, which, by the way, is an awful place. I mean, we might think, oh, isn't it lovely on the seashore? Yeah, but the mosquitoes. It's a very unhealthy place to be. So there has to be a reason. So he goes Sepphoris inland, lakeside, Tiberias. Now watch what Jesus does according to Matthew. He goes from inland Nazareth, a couple of miles from Sepphoris, all the way to Capernaum. Yeah, he's on the lake, and everything is going to happen on the northwest quadrant of the Sea of Galilee, Tiberias, in the early 20s. Parallel, he's there to oppose him. Now he's not moving to Tiberias. He wouldn't have made it to Jerusalem. So he goes there, and it's among the fishers, not the poorest of the poor, to be honest with you, not the street poor, because they have learned how to survive, maybe. But the people who yesterday had a boat, had their nets, and were able to go down to give some protein supplement to their family by casting a net into the lake. And now all of a sudden they can't do it, or they have to sell if they're allowed to catch anything or to have a boat. It's taxed, and they have to sell to Antipas's fish factories. And that's the danger. That's where revolution begins. When somebody who had something yesterday says, what happened? That's not fair. That's the traction. The prophets have been talking for what, 700 years about distributive justice and taking care of the poor and the widows and the orphans and the resident aliens. Of course, they've been saying that, the vulnerable ones. And in one sense, they've been going round and round. Jesus is saying the same. So why are they listening? They're listening because the time and the place is ripe. That's called traction. There are people who want to know, I didn't do anything wrong. Why can't I have a boat like I did in the past? A couple of families, maybe. That's not fair. And that's how revolutions begin, especially among the people who had it and have lost it, and they know they did nothing wrong. So wait a minute. All this stuff the prophets were talking and the Torah said this, and oh yeah, distributive. Wow, that's what it means. It's like a revelation. Oh, that's what's going on. So it's not the eternal laws of God. It's not the way it always was. It's the way the haves set it up to make certain the have-nots have not.
Mike, could you expand on why Jesus went to Jerusalem on Passover?
I think uh, just as why Jesus went to Lake Tiberias, that there was traction in along the coast of Lake Tiberias. There was energy, there was pain, there was suffering, there was anger, there was indignation. I think Jesus needed to begin in that place in order to gain traction, in order to encounter people in this building of the Reign of God movement that could listen to and embrace this message that Jesus was conveying. At some point, it seems that it became clear that the center of power, the place where much of the political, economic, and religious power that was held in that particular region, that it was in Jerusalem. And that if there was going to be a message, a clear message sent by Jesus and Jesus's Reign of God movement, that at some point or another, they had to go to that center, that regional center of power, and that was Jerusalem. And so, what better time, theologically, but also politically, to send that message than during Passover, the epicenter of Jewish religious life. What a dangerous time as well to go there. Not only did Jewish people come in massive numbers to Jerusalem during Passover, Rome also understood the precarious nature, kind of the tinderbox environment, as Dom's called it, of Passover in Jerusalem. And so Rome would make sure that they had plenty of soldiers on guard. Pilate understood each time of the year, well, we got to prepare for Passover, not to celebrate it, but to quell any slight rebellion through immediate force and violence that might surface. And so this very much was a tinderbox environment. And it's clear that the story of Passover still held a profoundly important role in Jewish life and in Jewish imagination and in Jewish theological imagination. And so while they're under Roman imperial domination, one of the things that still gives hope, not only faith, but it is this story of the Exodus. And so that story is a revolutionary story. There's no other way to describe it. It is a revolution. God inspired a revolution in Exodus from bondage. And so, what better place for Jesus to take his message? But that involved profound risk. It involved significant risk because of the nature of it. And the nature of Jesus's demonstrations were not passive. They were directly confronting Roman imperial and military power via the counter procession that was a direct challenge to Pilate's procession with soldiers and horses and armor and swords. And then you have Jesus's counter procession on a donkey.
Yeah.
It's a very humble procession of poor working people, peasants, and then the temple demonstration, which was intended to shut down the temple economy, to shut down the trade and exchange, to shut down the exploitative manner in which the temple was operating. And so, for this reason, we think all these are reasons as to why Jesus chose to go to Jerusalem during Passover.
Yeah, two things I'd like to stress. Michael's already done it. If you imagine the Fortress Antonia, called after Mark Antony, ironically, it's on the northwest corner of the temple. It overlooks the temple, okay? Now, you have all of these people, Jewish people, celebrating what? As Michael said, they're celebrating freedom from Egypt. Well, they're under Rome. All they got to do is look up at the soldiers walking along the parapets. Now, if anyone did anything, if they coughed too loudly, as it were, there was probably zero toleration because we had two huge riots during Passover. One in what, 4 BC, I think, and the other sometime in the 50s. Thousands of people were killed because it wasn't they were slaughtered, they were just simply trampled on. If the soldiers came down from the Antonia on the stairs, everyone would push to the southern gates. They'd be crushed alive. Thousands. So this is tinderbox, as Michael said, and zero toleration. Now, the other thing you have to watch is to try and figure out what Jesus is up to. And of course, if you want to talk about vicarious atonement and all the rest of it, that's fine. But I'm not trying to read Jesus's mind. I'm trying to watch his actions. And the two things that happen clearly, if you read Mark, and when all else fails, read the text. Mark says two things. The crowd is on the side of Jesus. Day after day, the authorities want to move, but they fear the crowd. He says it. He says it's using our term Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The crowd protects him. Every night he gets out of Jerusalem and goes to Bethany around the Mount of Olives. That's smart. If you want to get yourself killed, stay in Jerusalem. There's a full moon, of course, but dark streets and people disappear. So get out of the city every night. The crowd protects you by day, your relatives at Bethany protect you by night. And it's up then, of course, to Caiaphas to figure out how to get you halfway in between. Right between your day defenses and your night defenses, there is a place, and it's called Gethsemane, and it's right down there halfway when you've left the temple and you haven't got to Bethany. That's where any smart leader who wants to get Jesus would have known how to get him. So everything that I see in reading it tells me that Jesus goes to Jerusalem and expects to get away with it, and almost does. And that's conceded by Mark at the beginning of chapter 14. The authorities almost said, we give up because there's a danger of a riot, and that's worse than anything he does. So maybe let him do whatever he does and get out of town. He almost gets away with it. That's the truth. He does not go up to get martyred, because if he wanted to get martyred, he would be dead on Palm Sunday evening.
What do we know about violence? Let me start over. What do we know about violent resistance against Romanization, Dom?
All right, this is something I've been pressing hard in the last few years, and I think Jewish scholars and Christian scholars need to do their homework, because between the armed rebellion of 4 BCE and the armed rebellion, the Great War, you could call it, of 66 to 73, Jewish sages and thinkers explored non-violent resistance. Now, I'm not talking about Jesus or John the Baptist, before they ever got functioning by 6 CE, 6 of the Common Era. They were experimenting. I mean, it's almost common sense. We just had one tremendous rebellion in 4 BCE. Is there anything else we can do about Rome besides war and an armed rebellion which could destroy us? So they were exploring it, and we have the examples. And it's not in my mind. It's quite clear in Josephus against good old Pilate. There's 2 cases of of unarmed, like sit-down strikes. And then the huge one that you can read, and we should all read it, in Josephus and in Philo again, which tells the story that when Caligula, Gaius, the Emperor Gaius, called Caligula, as you know, nicknamed Caligula Little Boots, decided, well, if I'm divine, I think I should have my statue in Jerusalem's temple. And he tells Petronius, the governor of Syria, take your legions, at least 2 legions. So he knows what's coming. Take 2 legions and my statue, go up to the temple and put it in. That's not a peaceful caravan. Now, what happens, and you can read it, it's the time of harvesting or planting, one or the other. So there's an agricultural sit-down strike of thousands of Jews, men, women, and children, because you don't approach a legionary camp all men, because they might just kill you and figure out what's going on afterwards. So there's a huge organized sit-down strike, risking, of course, unarmed, as they say, and risking martyrdom. And that is there in the year 40, for example. So before Jesus and after Jesus, there's exploration, and Josephus tells it, and he hates it. I think he's more tolerant, to be honest, with armed rebellion, because that's what people do, and what can you do, and the legions take care of it, and that's life. Of course, he's against it, but he's really against this 4th philosophy, he calls it. There's the Sadducees and the Essenes, and there's the Pharisees, Sadducees. We've had these 3, but there's this 4th philosophy. He's almost spitting it through gritted teeth. There's this 4th philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Jesus and John the Baptist fit into that pattern. They don't invent it. It's invented by Jewish thinkers, I think in the experience of 6 CE, when they finally dumped Archelaus and put in a sub-governor, the one who will eventually become a Pilate. So I think we have to begin there. The experiments, and those are the terms, with nonviolent resistance in the period between 6 CE and 66, 60 years. And 66, of course, the war began and everything else changed.
Was there nonviolent resistance against Romanization, Mike?
Certainly. Nonviolent resistance against Romanization?
Yes, that's my question.
Yes, I think that's Jesus's movement as a clear example of it. Jesus's movement was fundamentally nonviolent in nature, and Jesus's teachings reflect this viewpoint that violence is abhorrent fundamentally, and I think that there's a recognition in Jesus's teachings that even those who perpetuate violence, that they themselves are children of God, and that any expression of violence against those who carry out violent acts, that we are reduced as humans, that our souls are reduced, that our spirits are reduced by carrying out violence against others who oppress us. And it's no more clear in Jesus's teachings than his teaching of loving our enemies,
Mhm.
that there's a transformative nature in love and in uh, what Gandhi called many, many, many years later, Satyagraha, or love force, truth force, which Gandhi drew from Jesus's teachings, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, that love has a transformative quality in nature that could change the oppressor, but that could also be a source of strength for the protagonist, the nonviolent protagonist. And so Jesus's teachings were predicated on this notion of the value of love, loving our neighbor, loving ourselves, loving our God, and loving our enemy. Love was at the center in many respects of Jesus's teaching. And Jesus' teaching solely advocated for nonviolent engagement. Um, and as we've seen over the course of history, many thinkers have picked up what Jesus taught and have adapted that into the philosophy of nonviolence. I spoke about Gandhi, um, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, many other civil rights leaders, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, they've all practiced they all practiced in their lifetimes in the social movements that they organized nonviolence. Jesus's movement was fundamentally a nonviolent movement. And I think we know that as well, historically speaking, because Dom's scholarship demonstrates that violent revolutionaries, when Rome would intervene and eventually, you know, conquer a violent revolution, they would massacre and execute publicly many, 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 many more people who were involved in violent revolutions than was the case when you had nonviolent revolutions. In the case of Jesus's nonviolent revolution, he was the one chosen to be crucified and publicly executed because he was the nonviolent revolutionary or the leader of that nonviolent revolution. And so the manner in which Rome chose to deal with Jesus's movement also demonstrates that it was a nonviolent movement based on the choice of who they chose to execute publicly.
Yeah.
Would you add anything else to that, Dom?
Well, it's very interesting that we have the civil law. Rome didn't worry too much about criminal law. You come at me with a sword, I kill you. I don't take your sword and put you on trial. Criminal law takes care of itself. That's what the legions take care of. Now, civil law, they talked about, and here's their term, those who create tumult or stir up the people. That's their term for what you and I would call activism. Non-violent activism. In it's civil law, and we have the text. It's the texts were gathered together around the year 200. It says, I'm quoting now more or less verbatim, Those who stir up the people or create tumult shall, according to their status, I love this, either be exiled to an island, sent to the beasts in the arena, or crucified. So in one sense, you have John of Patmos, Ignatius of Antioch, and Jesus right there, the three. Now, if you're somebody a bit important or if some patrons, yeah, we'll just exile you to an island. We won't get into more trouble than we want. But it's quite clear. They say nothing about rounding up your close followers, your supporters, your patrons, your top lieutenants. Rome's policy with non-violent resistance of any type, or what we would call activism, was to execute the leader. And if you guys are still at it 5 years from now, we just execute your next leader till you get the message. And that's why when Josephus and Tacitus describe what happened to Jesus, both of them say, of course, he was crucified. And they say nothing about his closest followers were strung up with him. So when Rome was dealing with violence, they could crucify you all the way from Capua to Rome to get the message. But when we do a non-violent, and we hang it around his neck in case we think this is just a thief or something. No, this is somebody who claimed to be king of the Jews. So we have a huge amount of information about Jesus, really, if we will read carefully against an historical matrix.
Did Josephus believe that Emperor Vespasian was the Messiah, Dom?
Well, he sure said so. Let me back up and try to understand what makes Josephus tick. And I've spent a lot of time doing it. Look, the first time I read Josephus was way back in the 50s. And here's what happened to me. I said, I'm reading Irish history. Everything that these people did, the Irish did. They had traitors, they had assassins. Wow, it's a typical occupied country. It's like Irish history all over again. So, in one sense, I was a little bit sympathetic. Now, what really terrifies Josephus, if I can understand him correctly, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think what terrifies him was he knew that a lot of this rebellion against Rome was based theologically and what we would call eschatologically and messianically. And so he's horrified if Rome catches up that our rebellions against them are based on our theology, on our religion, then the simplest thing is to ban our religion. The British figured that out with the penal laws with the Irish. If you can't really beat them, then maybe destroy the religion. It's indirect genocide, I'd call it. If you destroy people's religion, you may well destroy them. So that terrifies Josephus. So he says quite clearly, God who goes the round of the nations has given divine power to the Romans. So we're cool. It's given Roman power to the Flavian dynasty. Oops. And then what you referred to, that unspeakable statement, and it is unspeakable, that Vespasian was really the Messiah and that our people got it wrong because they heard that somebody coming from Israel was going to rule the world, and they thought that meant a Jew. But Vespasian came from Israel. Sure, he was burning it to the ground, and he was made emperor because, when there's a contest for emperor, it really helps to have the main armies under you in the field, because then you could kind of just go to Rome and become the emperor. Your legions will support you. After all, you're paying them. So yes, I think he believed it. I think he said we made a terrible mistake and we should not be opposing Rome on any type of a Messiah basis, a eschatological basis. Don't even speak of it. He would like to get rid of it. He fakes it all over the place. And he does know that it's theologically based. Now, whether he's convinced himself that it's a mistake, we know people in our own day and age can convince themselves to what they want to believe, maybe sincerely. I don't understand that process. But Josephus has convinced himself Vespasian is the Messiah. Do not oppose Vespasian or the Romans, or you're opposing God. Wow, that's quite clear. And he says it. And that's what's unforgivable. But I do understand he's terrified because after the Great War of 66 to 73, Rome penalized all the Jews of the whole world, the Roman world at least, by fining them so that the fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax, had to go not to their temple in Jerusalem, but to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. He fined them, all the Jewish race, men, women, and children. That's the first step towards saying, okay, I forbid the Jewish religion. It came dangerously close after the Great War. So Josephus is rightly terrified, and I'll give him the benefit of that doubt. And that's why after he writes the Jewish War for the Romans, he writes the Jewish Antiquities for his fellow Jews. He's dancing very dangerously on the tightrope.
What are we told about Jesus outside of the New Testament, Mike?
Mm.
Trying to think of the best way to answer that question. Dom, what's your thought on this with
Well,
regards to other
I
sources?
I think to be honest with you, we've just talked about that because the two most important
Yeah.
descriptions are at the end of the first century from Josephus and the beginning of the second century from Tacitus, and they have both figured out the story. There was this guy over there. We call him Christ because there's Christians who took his name. So, like Platonists follow Plato, Christians must follow Christ. He doesn't quite understand it. But okay, there was a guy over there in Judea. We know that. His name was Jesus or Christ. And he read some kind of an uprising or something, and we crucified him. And now here's the amazing thing. Josephus and Tacitus both have to explain then why is it still around?
Hmm.
Because we know the protocol is we execute nonviolent resistance and they all go away. That should be the end of the story. So why then at the beginning, about 70 years later, does Josephus and Tacitus have to explain to people why these bums in their language, these thugs are still around? And Josephus is honest enough to say, well, those who loved him before the crucifixion continue to love him afterwards. Okay, that's good enough. That's honest enough. Because Josephus is not looking for a fight in Rome in the 90s. There's Christians around. And of course, Tacitus, who can never write without a sneer on his lips, and he writes very well with a sneer on his lips, says, well, diseases spread. And this disease comes all the way from Judea to Rome, where everything rotten arrives eventually. Okay, but he admits it. It spread all the way from Judea to Rome. So from those two, and those I trust, I really trust them. They're trying to explain to people who these, maybe they're thinking these idiots, but that's all right. These idiots Christians are. Clearly, they're after somebody called the Christ. Aristotelians, Pythagoreans, they're all called after. So who is this guy? And there's their story. But they spend half the time in that space explaining why they're still around. Now, they're not going to say anything theological, but they both have to admit it. And that contradicts, of course, the expectations from the civil law that we take out the leader, and that's the end of the movement. So I consider there's all sorts of others I've read and I've argued and I've failed dismally to convince people that maybe this is independent of the God. I've almost given up, to be honest, Jacob and Michael. You can make an argument. Is the material in the Gospel of Thomas? I think it's independent. I think it is. I still think it is. Has anyone been able to persuade anyone about it? No, as far as I can see, Gospel of Peter. So to be honest with you, I've almost given up. And what I'm focusing on right now, if you read the stuff that is available, like that civil law about what we do with people who stir up the people, or Tacitus and Josephus, or Josephus himself, there is enough there to tell us that this guy, Jesus, called the Christ, whatever that nickname is, like the Baptist is, John is called the Baptist, that's another nickname, whatever. But they were crucified as the leader of a nonviolent movement. That you would get from them if we never had the New Testament and bothered to read their texts about this guy, Jesus or the Christ. And the same thing, you could find out a certain amount there, not about Peter, not about Paul, but James, James the Just, James of Jerusalem, James the brother of the Lord. Yeah, you'd find out about him. And you'd know he was the brother of this guy, Christ. So, yes, if you really could leave aside for the moment and read that seriously, you'd find we have a huge amount there before we ever get to the gospel. So that's what I would stress, Michael. And in one sense, there's no reason that ordinary people should be reading Josephus, but they should know it exists
Yeah.
and they should know what they're told about what's there. But I, I don't expect ordinary Christians to spend their time reading Josephus, but it would be very different if the two things everyone had to read before they got to the New Testament, before they even knew New Testament, was Virgil's Aeneid for the Roman world in English. Sure, you can get the point in English. It's nice if you know Latin, but you can get it in English. And Josephus' Jewish War. Those two would be a magnificent combined matrix. Then to go into the New Testament. If you start with the New Testament, this is probably hard to say it, and maybe I'll have to take it back. You'll get everything wrong. You'll think, oh, wow, wow, Jesus walked on water. To which my response is, big deal, who cares? Are you telling me as soon as I'm baptized, I'm off and running across the Atlantic? No. So then I say, could we read the text? And we find out that people take off in the boat without Jesus and they row like mad all night and get nowhere. And then they invite Jesus back in the boat and everything's okay. It screams to me, I'm a parable, stupid. Keep Jesus in the boat. Or you'll row all night and get nowhere. And I look at the modern church rowing like mad and getting nowhere. Like the government sitting, as it were, on rocking chairs, all motion, no progress. I mean, I can't not see it. And to distill that into Jesus could walk on water, to which everyone kind of shrugs their shoulder and either believes it as who cares, but keep Jesus in the boat. So by the 50s, 60s, 70s, people knew that there was an inclination to get him out of the boat. You know, we do this by ourselves. You know, he's fine. He's over there walking on the water. We're rowing and we're doing great. Keep Jesus in the boat. It's a parable.
Mhm.
It's a parable. Now, I get that from reading it, honestly. Read the whole text. This is Marcus Borg and my new motto. We used to say, when in doubt, read the text. If all else fails, read the text. Kind of sarcastically. All right, sorry, Jacob, I talked too long there.
Oh no, it's fine. Um, we do have a super chat question from iFishnatai. Thank you for your super chat. Why did Yochanan ben Zakkai call Vespasian Messiah?
Well, I think actually that whole program of nonviolent resistance that I talked about became eventually the program of the Jewish people after the war. They had, as you well know, another rebellion in what, 115 to 117 all across North Africa, which was huge almost. And maybe it, and there was another in the homeland, 132 to 135. And after that, that was it. That's four armed rebellions in 200 years, the first 200 years of Roman occupation. That's pretty heavy going. Well, I suppose it's not heavier than Ireland and the British Empire. So anyway, um, but after that, Jewish holiness took place, not in the temple, which was gone, and not in disputes with Rome, but holiness in the home and in the synagogue. And that's why Josephus would never have been preserved, the text, I mean, if it wasn't for Christians. Judaism didn't preserve Josephus. I don't know when, if I don't know if there ever was a Jewish, I'm talking now about the modern age, all through the Middle Ages, Christians were interested in reading Josephus because they were using him. See, his war with Rome tells us all the same stuff as in the New Testament. So I think Ben Zakkai, the movement afterwards was no more rebellion, no more criticism of Rome. The Pharisees take over, and basically the view that Josephus had advocated became normative for about 2,000 years.
What is the Great Omission?
All right, the Great Omission was a phrase I made up. What I meant is this: every single event, major event in the life of Jesus, whether it's made up or not, is told in the New Testament. So if you're an artist and I say, I'd like a picture, please, of the baptism of Jesus, you can go read the accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and, well, you can't get John, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and, write accordingly. Now, supposing I ask you, supposing I'm the Emperor Constantine, and I tell my head artist in Constantinople, I want a picture of the moment of the resurrection. Oh, yeah, yes, Your Imperial Highness, I have one here of the women coming to. I don't want the women coming to the tomb. I want the moment of the resurrection. Show me Jesus rising. That's the great omission. I'm not going to tell Constantine that. There is no description of the most important thing in the life of Jesus. What was it like when he was rising? Not the effects, the results, the consequences, the apparitions, the doubting Thomas with Mary Magdalene, not that stuff. The moment. What did the guards in Matthew see and lie about? That's what I call the great omission. And it took hundreds of years before artists were able, in the Western and the Eastern, to draw what they thought the resurrection looked like. That's the great omission. There is no description in there in the canonical texts. The Gospel of Peter tries to do it. How would you describe the resurrection moment, the Paschal instant? Before Jesus and Mary Magdalene, before Jesus and the women, before anything. That's the great omission. That's what we have to face to understand then that the Western tradition and the Eastern tradition of Christianity have totally divergent images when they come to produce them.
What is
Would
the
you say?
Go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, Jacob. What I would add, Jacob, this section of the chapter, this last chapter was probably the most difficult. Would you agree, down to right?
Yeah,
There's so much there. What we tried to convey is the importance of how we interpret the resurrection story as a part of or being in continuity with Jesus's life and his public execution. How do we understand all those things, all these things as interrelated? How is the resurrection story connected to Jesus's nonviolent reign of God movement? One of the critical conclusions and takeaways that we hope to convey through this work is that Jesus's resurrection is not meant to be solely interpreted through an individualistic lens, that Jesus is saving me, that it's just my individual salvation that is at stake here as a result of Jesus's resurrection, but that there's a much grander universal element at stake here. And that's that we are called collectively to be engaged in the ongoing um, nurturing, building, organizing, developing of the reign of God here on earth. That we're meant to, just as Jesus's resurrection represents an overcoming of the forces of death and despair and evil, we are meant to be engaged in that work in the here and now. Death was all around Jesus and his people. The Roman Empire was a machine of death. They produced death everywhere they went. Death, death, death. Death was part of life in horrific ways. Public executions were quite common in Roman society and Judea. We also live in a society of death. Our economy produces suffering and death on a global scale. Our environment is rapidly unwinding because of the causes of man-made natural and ecological destruction. Um, Death is present, and there are forces that are causing death that we as a human body, the body of Christ, need to be engaged in this liberatory work. The story of the Exodus reveals theologically that God is a God of liberation, that God is a God of justice, that God is a God of compassion and mercy. If we recognize this, that helps us understand if this is the nature of God, then what does that mean for us? What does that mean for Jacob, for Dom, for Michael, and for all of us who profess to be Christians? The other significant question is that we posed at the beginning of the book is the distinction between worshiping Jesus and following Jesus. And clearly, Jesus's example is quite a challenging one to follow, right? We all must admit that. But we are called as Christians to follow Jesus. It doesn't mean that we can't worship Jesus, but far too often, worshiping Jesus comes at the cost of any attempt to follow Jesus. Following Jesus is social by nature. Certainly, we need to incorporate from a personal perspective in our spiritual lives. What does that mean? So there's an individual dimension to it, but following Jesus is social by nature. It involves being in community, it involves being in the world, it involves wrestling with suffering and despair and oppression. And it means being engaged with the God of justice and the God of liberation in that ongoing project of the building of God's reign. That is the interpretation of the universal resurrection, that the world is constant, that resurrection is happening resurrection is happening constantly in this world, and that we must be engaged in the work of resurrection in an ongoing way.
Yeah, there's one place, Michael, especially where that's focused. There's one place where we give two images side by side, and they're two images taken from the wall of a tiny little church on the Troodos Mountains in Cyprus, medieval church. They're they're both called in Greek the Anastasis Christou, the resurrection of Jesus. That's written on them, so we don't have to debate what we're watching. But in one of them, Jesus is climbing out of the sepulchre. It's not the 1 foot, kind of one leg in, one leg out. He's halfway out, and it's the resurrection of Jesus all by himself. And right next to that, on the same wall, Mary Magdalene's in between, there is Jesus, and he's out, and he's got Adam and Eve by the wrist, and he's yanking them out of their sepulchres. Well, in one case, he's alone, and in another case, he's taken the whole human race with him. And I would ask people to look at those two pictures and just ask themselves, what on earth is going on? Don't jump immediately to the solution. What is it? What does it mean to take Adam and Eve? I mean, That's the only way you can symbolize the whole human race in the biblical tradition. Good old Adam and Eve. Adam has been dead a long time. He's long beard. Eve is the mother of the living, so she's usually beautiful. But they're both dead and being yanked out of their tomb. So it's about the human race. It's about the world. It's about God so loved the world. Oops. Me and everyone else in the world, of course. Of course, not the empty world, but the occupied world. But if you said God so loved us, then maybe the world is that's just like a whatever. But you start with the world and everything else comes with it. Adam and Eve. So I would ask people just go to it's figure one, I think. Look at those two pictures. You can probably find the originals if you go researching on the internet, because you can find anything on the internet today. And ask yourself, what's the difference? Just that. This is the Western tradition. This is the Eastern tradition, Eastern Christianity. What's the difference between those two images? Could you put them together? What? It's called thinking.
We have another super chat question from iFish and a Tie. Thank you for your super chat. What did followers experience with the risen Jesus?
I think it's a very good question for me at the moment. Did they experience visions? And by a vision, a vision is is something. Let me back up. A vision, first of all, is not an hallucination. If you've had an hallucination, you don't know you've had an hallucination. That's the whole point of the movie A Beautiful Mind, is that you think everything is happening. If you've had a vision, you know you've had a vision. That's the difference between a vision and a hallucination. I've had a vision. Now, what I do about it is another question. So the first question is, were people after the death of Jesus having visions, and then they had to interpret it? Was it this? Was it that? Whatever. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation, which is a very strong one at the moment, is that there's a huge amount of discussion in the Old Testament itself about the vindication of the just. Here's where you can see it coming up for discussion. In the book of Daniel, the first half of the book is those magnificent stories about individual salvation. Daniel in the lion's den. Fabulous story. Down he goes and up he comes. No problem. They're all pussycats. The three men in the fiery furnace, they just have a nice warm glow on them when they come out. So God saves individuals. So if you're threatened, hang in there, and God at the last minute will protect you. Now, the second half of the book of Daniel says, this ain't working. This ain't working. We have to imagine that people may be killed in the Maccabean times, and God in the next world, not in this world, will save them and reward them. So these are up for discussion at the time. Clearly, God did not intervene and take Jesus off the cross like Daniel in the lion's den or the three men in the fiery furnace. What happened? That's a question that could come from visions. It could, but not necessarily. It could come from all the teaching for the preceding 150 years since the book of Daniel in how does divine justice operate? Does it operate in this world by divine intervention, like the stories claim? Remember Joseph in Genesis? Everything works out fine because he's faithful to God. God's faithful to him, and he ends up running Egypt. Okay, if if that works for you, good. But it's not working. So they're imagining something else. That's where resurrection comes in. So they're probing this. I would have expected, honestly, that how they would have interpreted what happened to Jesus is simply ascension. Like Romulus ascended among the gods, like Moses ascended to God, I would have thought Jesus has ascended to God. The tomb is empty, Jesus has ascended. But they're claiming resurrection, which is a different whole thing. It involves the world, as Michael was just saying. So this is the cusp of thought at the moment. It's not like it's all worked out. When Michael said it was the most difficult to organize, to explain, because all of this is up for discussion at the moment. There are, for example, atheistic philosophers in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in Slovenia, in France, who are insisting that we treat Paul, for example, as a philosopher, valid in his discussions of all of this for our present world. And of course, if if you're getting serious about Paul, even if you're an atheistic thinker getting serious about Paul, you better be getting serious about Jesus, because Paul spends all his time talking about Jesus. So it's kind of hard to get rid of Jesus and keep Paul. So all of that is at the moment discussion going on at the moment. And that's what we're kind of touching on in that third chapter.
The other thing I would just add real quickly, Jacob, to what Dom just shared is what is the story trying to convey? I think is really to that particular audience is really important, I think, to reflect upon. The Exodus story, if we read the Exodus story and walk away from it with no understanding or interpretation that or recognition that this is an anti-imperial story, that this is a revolutionary story, we've missed so much of what the story is trying to convey with regards to the Exodus story. We also lose sight of what the story is trying to convey theologically about the nature of God. A few things that we could pull from the story of the Exodus. God is a God of justice. God is a God of freedom. God is a God of liberation. God is a God of mercy. God is a God of justice. And that God also needs us. God needed Moses, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses's people to do their part. God was not going to pick them up by their pants and push them out of Egypt. They had to do that part. They had to play a part in God's liberative movement. Similarly, the resurrection story. We see that Jesus, these titles of Son of Man, Son of God, Prince of Peace, that these were bestowed upon Jesus, certainly for rich theological reasons, and also as a significant challenge to Roman imperial theology and ideology. And so the resurrection story, one way we think about it as well, is that Jesus being executed and then resurrected is a demonstration that not even Roman power could ultimately kill this movement and Jesus, that there was a rebellious nature to the story, that the movement continues, that unlike other movements that the Roman Empire had squashed violently, this movement still has energy, still has force, still has momentum, and is not going anywhere. That a part of this that we should walk away with is that to that first that audience, that original Jesus community, there is a rebellious nature to the story about God's redemption, that the Roman Empire cannot ultimately destroy a movement that is of God, and that the movement continues. That is a story that, in some respects, continues to be critical towards the Roman Empire, that continues to challenge the Roman Empire. That Roman power, Roman violence does not have the last word, I think is one key interpretation that we need to remember and walk away with. And I think this is part of Christianity that's lost, is the inherent anti-imperialism that is core to Christianity, that is core to being followers of Jesus, that there's a resistance to the forces of death then and now. that God, the nature of God, is always a God of justice and love and righteousness and peace and liberation, which means that those forces that are against that are forces that we, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, must be engaged in pushing back against, non-violently, of course.
And in my final question for both of you, what are the present challenges for the research on the historical Jesus?
Hmm. I'll take a shot at it and then Michael. Basically, we've touched on it in the book, understanding what went on in Galilee and how the commercialization of the lake gave Jesus traction to get the movement going, especially among fishers. You think if Jesus was just modeling himself on the Old Testament, he should have gone looking for peasants, plowmen, as it were, like Elijah and Elisha. Going for fishers, whoever does that. Cincinnatus in Rome doesn't go looking for, if you want to look for a good person in the ancient world, you went for the peasant, as it were. The ideal was the peasant. Even the aristocrats let on that the ideal was the peasant. So fishers, so that's the first thing. Understand all that's going on in Galilee that gives Jesus a movement, first of all, momentum that brings him up to Jerusalem. And the second thing, why does he go there? Does he go there to get himself martyred, either for vicarious atonement, St. Anselm's unfortunate suggestion at the end of the 1000s, 1098, or does he go there for obedient suffering, very much in the Catholic tradition? He goes there to take his movement to the capital and he expects to get away with it. That's the historical truth, and he almost does. That's the best we can do. And then to try and understand what is what is the result of people trying to imagine afterwards what happened to Jesus? Where is Jesus? What happened to his movement? And to do it historically. To begin by not saying resurrection as if the term was ever used, it was about Jesus. Resurrection was there as Pharisaic theology before Jesus ever existed. So when Paul, as a Pharisee, comes and says Jesus is the start of the resurrection, you have to know what resurrection is to know what the start of. So all of those are up for serious discussion outside fundamentalism. There is no serious discussion in fundamentalism, either in legal fundamentalism or biblical fundamentalism in our country at the moment. We just keep repeating the same thing and hope everyone will accept it.
That's where I'll pick up in where you just ended. The threat, the danger of religious fundamentalism in our world today, combined with Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
We very much see this present in our country. It's nothing new in particular, but it is very prevalent in a powerful religious force today in our society. In that Christianity, or the message of Jesus, the person of Jesus, has been used and is being used as a cudgel to really advance an economic agenda, a global agenda, a political agenda, a military agenda that is just frankly um, diametrically opposed in many respects to everything Jesus stood for in his lifetime. And not only that, do Jesus's gospel teachings help us to recognize that if we read them with seriousness, but history also helps us to recognize this as well. And history here is so critically important in understanding Jesus's message. What was he conveying? What was he doing? Why was he executed publicly for what he did and what he said? And our hope as well is that this message in the book conveys the original Jesus program in a way, perhaps is how we can put it. And that it also, by conveying what this original program was, what was Jesus trying to attempt, it is also our attempt to challenge religious fundamentalism, Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, which is pervasive in our country and world today, in the ways that Christian nationalism endorses violence, militarism, colonialism, greed, avarice, exploitation, things that are fundamentally diametrically opposed to Jesus's message. We have to challenge the ways in which religion has and continues to be abused by the powerful, by the rich, the ways in which religious hierarchy and clergy and religious institutions continue to align themselves and their institutions with the haves rather than the have-nots, which is something that certainly Jesus was concerned with and that he challenged during his lifetime, as we see in the temple demonstration. This is still very much a part of our political life in which politicians seek to align themselves with religious authorities, to shield themselves, to cloak themselves with not only moral but spiritual authority, which is profoundly dangerous, profoundly dangerous. And so the historical Jesus is incredibly important in our world today in Christian circles to better understand what was Jesus attempting to do during his lifetime? And what are we to do today in this very present moment in our day to continue to carry this message forward and to be collaborators with God in bringing about a more just, peaceful, loving world, which we very desperately need in light of the multitude of crises that we face as a species, that our world faces with regards to the existential crisis of global warming. I could go on and on and on, but this is a core part of the book.
And before we close, I'd like to remind everybody real quick the link to purchase Jesus and Justice will be in the Amazon affiliate link, which is in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, Dom and Mike, thank you both for joining me today.
And thank you very much, Jacob, for having us.
Thank you, Jacob. It was a real pleasure, honor, and thank you to everybody who's listened in and joined us and for having us